In October 1945, 50,000 American Marines invaded northern China. The official reason was to accept the surrender of Japanese troops and evacuate them, but the primary reason was to secure Western business interests. Western corporations had billions of dollars invested in China, mostly located in mini colonies called settlements. The Americans allied with the official Chinese government, led by Chiang Kai-shek, to secure all of China. However, his Kuomintang party, known as the KMT, was corrupt and unpopular. Most Chinese supported the opposition Chinese Communist Party, known as the CCP, led by Mao Zedong. By 1949, the Marines and the KMT had fled China. This American military intervention was called Operation Beleaguer, led by the 3rd Marine Amphibious Force. The Chinese were happy that the war was over and the Japanese were leaving. All went well the first couple of years as U.S. Marines returned to their pre-war bases, shown here in film shot before the war by Marine Colonel Harvey Walseth. Marines guarded the international settlements and reoccupied Camp Holcomb, which was built in 1912 by the U.S. Army after the Boxer Rebellion. The Marines ordered the 600,000 Japanese soldiers to continue protecting their areas from Chinese communists. The Americans did not want the CCP to capture weaponry or cities, but leaving armed Japanese soldiers in charge for months angered local Chinese. Most of the KMT army was in the south, so a huge effort began to fly them to North China, where they took over from the Japanese and disarmed them. Wealthy business interests within the KMT reoccupied the banks, factories, and commercial properties as Japanese forces departed. The United States attempted to mediate a peace conference between the KMT and CCP, who were engaged in a civil war before the Japanese invasion. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong met in Chongqing in 1945 to discuss a unified government, but the differences were too great. The CCP had spun off from the KMT years before. The initial effort was to unite China under a single government by defeating various warlords. Many Chinese in the KMT wanted to redistribute conquered farmland to peasants, but most leaders saw no need to break up feudal estates. The CCC was formed by those who supported this land reform. American President Harry Truman wrote in his memoir, quote, "It was perfectly clear to us that if we told the Japanese to lay down their arms immediately and march to the seaboard, the entire country would be taken over by the communists. We therefore had to take the unusual step of using the enemy as a garrison until we could airlift Chinese national troops to North China and send Marines to guard the seaports." Most Chinese favored the CCP idea of land redistribution. The CCP was also appealing since it established programs to help the poor, while KMT leaders focused on amassing wealth. American Marines patrolled the major roads and occasionally skirmished with CCP units that had moved into towns. The Soviet Union had invaded Manchuria in 1945, just before Japan's surrender. As its forces withdrew home, they gave the CCP captured Japanese weapons, to include tanks. American aid to the KMT included substantial amounts of World War II surplus military equipment and supplies. Within 2 years, the KMT had received $4.4 billion from the United States. U.S. equipped and trained KMT forces deployed near CCP forces. The confident KMT army invaded Manchuria to destroy the CCP, but was soundly defeated. KMT soldiers had fought bravely against the invading Japanese, but most admired the CCP. In 1948, the CCP launched major offensives and the KMT retreated southward as entire units defected. Some American generals and political leaders advocated direct American military intervention to support the KMT, but the American people had no interest in fighting another major war. Several American leaders in China had contempt for the corrupt KMT. They favored improving relations with the winning CCP to ensure business access and its independence from the Soviet Union. The CCP was a nationalist movement and refused a return of Western corporate operations, but also refused to become puppets of the Soviets. Operation Beleaguer was a failure and wasted billions of dollars. It was unnecessary since the Japanese could have peacefully withdrawn to coastal ports to surrender and return home. American leaders had overestimated the KMT and underestimated the CCP. The 50,000 American Marines managed the chaotic conditions well and withdrew after only 35 Marines were killed and 43 wounded. Who lost China became a major political issue in the United States. The communist victory in China led to similar crises in Korea and Vietnam, where popular communist movements threatened traditional colonial and feudal rule. The loss of China encouraged American leaders to deploy American combat forces to Korea and Vietnam, which resulted in bloody failures.